welcome everyone to the Nerd Journey Podcast, episode number 158. We're joining you every week to talk IT career progression and bring you the advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers. I'm your host, John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_. Hey Nick, how's it going?
Doing great. Greetings from a very cold Fort Worth, Texas. We are both pre-sales technical engineers with backgrounds in IT operations. We hope our career discussions will be vendor neutral, relevant across disciplines, and remain timeless. If you're enjoying our content, please drop us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us, tweet or DM at Nerd Journey. Ultimately, we're just two nerds on a journey.
A journey to career enlightenment.
So let's take a trip.
Awesome, Nick. Hey, so today is the start of a new series of interviews. And I don't remember who we're interviewing. Remind me again?
Andy Syrewicze.
Yes, Andy. This is going to be our standard two-parter, right?
Actually, John, this is a trilogy.
Oh, three-part interview. It's like I don't know anything about this at all.
It's all good.
That didn't sound scripted. But anyway.
It's all natural.
Yeah, totally natural, organic intros, guys. So the thing that, now that I've said that I don't know who our interview is with or, how long it is, the thing that I think, undercuts that is me, telling the stuff that I really enjoyed about this, this first part. And it's two words, fearlessness and hunger. So, I don't want to undercut, what's actually, going on there, but I want people to listen for those words, fearlessness and hunger.
Oh man, I guess I'm going to give away more than John does here. I'm going to say listen for the breadth of experience that Andy talks about in this episode in different roles across different industries in the tech industry. I think that was really interesting. You'll find even a move to management. We'll see how that went, right? And I want you to listen super carefully to the very end about how Andy makes career decisions and what he does before he says yes.
Can't wait to listen again. All right, without further ado, let's get on to episode 158, part 1 of 3 with Andy Syrewicze. Andy Syrewicze, thanks for joining us on the Nerd Journey. Can you tell us who you are and what your day job is?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me. So yeah, again, my name is Andy Syrewicze, and I am a technical evangelist for Altero Software, who is part of the Hornet Security Group. So that merger kind of happened back at the beginning of 2021. So Hornet Security and Altero, when you see my name around the net, you see one of those two names. They're kind of interchangeable at this point. But Hornet Security is the larger brand. That is the master brand, right? So probably a longer answer than you were looking for there, but there it is.
Well, it makes sense because I wondered why I saw the Hornet Security thing, and I thought he worked for Altero.
Yep.
Okay, it makes sense.
Yeah, so Altero was acquired by Hornet Security at the beginning of 2021. So Hornet Security being a email security, M365 security company, they brought Altero in for the backup components of that equation.
Does that mean your evangelist responsibilities have expanded into a larger suite of products, or is it still the same focus?
Absolutely. So I can still talk about the backup stuff day in and day out, backwards and forwards, right? But definitely, like you said, the responsibility area has expanded, right? So that includes email security now and M365 security, because the company focuses on M365 as a primary platform. So yeah, definitely.
That's really interesting. I was wondering maybe if we could back up. How did you actually get started in the industry? Like what kind of drew you? Was it, when you were a kid, out of college, out of high school? Where did that happen?
I don't know. I kind of got my start how I imagine many IT pros got their start. Growing up, they were interested in, at least for me, I had a lot of interest in computer games. So I had a 486 was my first computer, and I couldn't even tell you how old I was, 8, 9. And I was able to figure out enough of it to, okay, this is how I shut down Windows 3.1 and now I'm in DOS, right? And I can run, Disney Coaster or Space Quest 2. Or I forget what the other big DOS
Space
games
Quest
I had
was
at the time.
greatness.
It was. Space Quest was one of my favorites. I had King's Quest 2 as well. But anyway, so I kind of started back then tinkering around, figuring out how to run these games. I was never in a situation where I had to borrow memory from here to allocate it over here. I was never in one of those situations, thankfully, but tinkered enough back then to get really interested in computers. And fast forward to high school, I took every tech class that was available at my small little high school in rural Michigan. But, was tearing apart computers in tech class, building my own custom builds at home. I think my first official build that I did myself was, you guys remember when the AMD Athlon 64s came out? And they used it as this big marketing mechanism, right? Oh, now 64-bit. And of course we all thought it was awesome, but really, knowing what I know now, it's like, wait a second, there probably wasn't even any 64-bit application that was utilizing it back then, right? But, I thought I was all big and cool when I was that age and had my own gaming computer that had the, Athlon 64 on the front. Anyway, segue. But yeah, so, after that, it kind of grew into this, hey, I'm actually pretty good at this whole tech thing, and ended up going to, what was it? I think my junior year of high school. I ended up working for the high school I was going to for the summer, doing my first IT job. Really, it was just desktop administration, refreshing labs, that type of stuff. I think the first big project I worked on there was the Windows 98 to 98 SE upgrade across several computer labs. So that's kind of how I got started.
Yeah, desktop support. That's the way a lot of folks get into the industry.
It is.
That help desk area that puts you basically the front line to end users.
Yep. That is one of two patterns we've seen. Desktop support, and the other is, oddly enough, high school teacher. Those are the two patterns.
In this case, high school tech support, right?
It was, yep. And I'll tell you, I can't describe how, what's the word I want to use? Interesting, unique it was to provide desktop support for teachers who would be my teachers the next year and or were my teachers the previous year. So that was something of a unique experience.
Hopefully they looked at you as a trustworthy fellow.
They did. Most did. I had a fairly good reputation in high school, I'll say. So I didn't really run into a lot of problems there, thankfully.
You mentioned, being in a classroom, in a lab where you were tearing apart computers and building new ones. Is that something, I wonder if you just have an opinion on this. A lot of times people become successful because they have lost the fear of breaking something. And people are inhibited from becoming more familiar with technology because they're fearful of breaking something. So I was just wondering if you had a strong opinion on that.
So a strong opinion on whether a fear of breaking stuff is a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, whether that inhibits understanding and whether, losing that fear can help you progress.
Gotcha. I think I'm of two minds of this. And there was a career event that contributes to my split decision on this. So I would say back then, when I was in high school, tearing stuff apart, upgrading labs, I would say I had very little fear of breaking stuff. I always had a high degree of faith in myself that I could resolve any issue that I could create. Fast forward to, let's see, this would be my first year after high school. I went to work full-time, basically, for that same high school. That was my first full-time IT job. And it was a situation that I was able to fix and resolve myself, but what ended up happening was, I don't even remember how it came about or how I did it. I somehow nuked an entire application share off of the file server. Now, this was like the worst application share that you could get rid of. I mean, we're talking district financials, student grade databases. Like full on panic mode. So this school district was pretty spread out over 25, 30 miles. I'm at like one of the remote sites. So I called my boss and I'm like, hey, can you take a look at the S drive real quick? And he's just like, it's all gone. I'm like, yeah, I'll be right there, and I'll recover it from the from the backups. And so I drove all the way back, and this is in the days of tape backups, right? So we were running, I think, Veritas at the time. It was backup exec. What was it? The first time Veritas owned backup exec.
Yep, I remember backup exec.
And I'm sitting there praying at the tape machine as it's recovering the data, and thankfully everything was recovered, no harm, no foul. But that was one of those career learning events where it's like, hey, I need to really think twice when I'm doing anything that could affect data in any way, shape, or form. And, well, I actually think about things 3 or maybe 4 times before I do anything like that these days. So that was, I would say, a positive learning event. At the time, it was potentially catastrophic, but I would say that there's benefits of both sides of that, right? I mean, I think there was some benefits in the early days of my career of not being afraid to break things, because it allowed me to really dive in and get my hands on a lot of stuff that some people might have been afraid of. But once you get to a certain level, I really feel that you need to develop a healthy respect for the data, especially, right? And I don't know, you become a more seasoned IT pro, in my opinion, when you run into a situation like that.
I guess when you have a smaller blast radius, then
right.
Tinkering is maybe okay, and fear is something that might inhibit you. But as soon as you have that large blast radius, then
right. It's funny you mention that. I mean, you think about how IT has changed over the years. I mean, back then it was it was an application share. Now we have certain IT pros in the field today that the blast radius, as you say, is the U.S. West Coast or the U.S. East Coast if we're talking about a major cloud provider, right? So yeah, definitely. I like that description.
If the packets don't get there, it doesn't matter.
That's right.
That's you also start to change how you shop for backup software. You're like, oh, it has backup in the name, but really I want recovery in the name also.
That's the funny thing. I talk about with prospects all the time, have that conversation of like, hey, backup is the easy part, right? Recovery is like what you guys really want and when you want it, right?
What's extremely interesting is it sounds like you learned that lesson at an extremely early point in your career, and I'm just curious if that eventually drove you to get into the industry you're in now, like that market.
Maybe I wouldn't say directly. It certainly helped because I had, like I said, you develop a really healthy respect for data in that situation. I'm trying to think of what age I was when that happened. I had to have been, it was like I said, the year after high school. I had to have been 19 when that happened. 19. So, I mean, fairly young, and honestly, for a kid going into IT, that was a good age to get that lesson out of the way early, right?
Yeah, you have to learn some of those just by messing it up. There's really no other way to feel the fear.
Definitely.
Or worry.
Yep.
How long did you stay at that role?
That role, I was probably there for 2 years. So I say full time. I was full time contracted, so 40 hours a week on a contractor basis. So I kind of also started doing some, I don't know, people would call it beer money work today, right? I wasn't old enough to drink then, obviously, but that's what I'm going to call it, just to describe it as this, little odd jobs here and there. I did some work for a different school system. I don't know, it was like a 10-minute drive north of where I live. So a different school district in the area. I did some work for them on and off. There was also a manufacturer where I had a couple of buddies working on the manufacturing lines there that they knew the guys in IT, and through those connections, I was able to get in there to start contracting for them, which would ultimately lead to my next official IT role, was working for a Fortune, I think they're Fortune 100 manufacturer, fairly large organization. So going from small K through 12 education IT to, huge corporate, you're just a tiny cog in the machine, corporate IT, was quite a jump.
How about that difference in user base? Because at a high school, you're supporting students and teachers, right? Teachers that
Yep.
are inputting grades and other things. In a manufacturing company, it may be that the ERP system went down. It may be that this machine can't pull programs from the network. This person can't clock in and track their time.
Oh, yeah.
That somebody can't cut checks for the whole company. It's intense.
It is. Yeah, thankfully, from a career trajectory point of view, I'm thankful that it was just for what I would call a branch site. So I was not part of the larger team that was responsible for IT for the entire organization. I was on a team responsible for a single plant. So in terms of users, 400, 500, 600 users probably. And then we answered to the larger corporate IT team. So, I mean, at the time, sure, I would have liked to be part of the larger corporate team, right? But kind of thankful now. Again, I'm older and wiser now. Kind of thankful that, again, we go back to the blast radius discussion. Not that I didn't make any mistakes like that there, thankfully. But it was a smaller user base. But still, it was a good introduction to that world of corporate IT culture, budgets, just corporate culture, right? Quite a change from where I came from.
Is part of that like having governance overhead, like from a central authority saying, oh, you have to do things this way? Or was it a little bit more autonomous as long as you met like a certain, just criteria?
We were really lucky in that it was pretty autonomous as long as we met, like you said, certain criteria. I think really the only big kind of centralized thing was licensing, right? Because the larger IT organization at the time, they get better pricing through bulk ordering, right, for the entire organization. So I think that was the one big sticking block with corporate IT. Yeah, I mean, we even ran our own in-house Exchange server at the time, Exchange 5.5. Yay. The information storing that thing was always going down. But hey, that was Exchange 5.5, right? But yeah, I think that was the only sticking point with corporate IT, thankfully.
Did that mean that you could make your own decisions about software to buy and how things were organized? Or was that was just not only the buying centralized, but also the decision on what to buy was centralized?
I would say that it was kind of a mix of both. Yeah, there might be some larger corporate initiatives where they're like, I seem to remember there was one project where, hey, we don't want any workstations in the entire fleet that are older than 5 years, right? Like there was something along those lines that was driven from the top down, and the money came from the top down. But there were other conversations where we as a local team would make the decision saying, hey, this is the budget that corporate has given us for the year. Hey, we need 2 new physical servers for, A and B, whatever, right? And we make that decision locally, and there was very little input from corporate IT in that situation.
Here's a question, Andy. In that model, moving into the manufacturing IT space, did you find computer literacy in general to be an issue at all? And the reason I ask that question is what I have seen is that someone may be an excellent operator of a particular machine, but they may not be extremely skilled in using different programs on a workstation out in the shop for different things, like clicking through the ERP system for timekeeping.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would definitely agree with that of like your shop floor operators, the people that are actually operating the machinery. And like you said, they're very talented at operating that machinery. There are machines out on that shop floor that even today, I still don't know what they were doing, right? They were building something, but I don't know what they were doing. Yeah, I would definitely say there was a kind of a tech literacy issue. They knew how to do the basics, log in, track their time, open up the application that ran whatever machine they were working on that day, and away they went. Yep, and that was about it.
What I'm getting at here is I think that early in your career, there was an element of education that you had to provide others that isn't that different maybe than what you do now as part of your evangelist role.
That's a good point. It's an interesting observation. I've never made that observation myself before, but that's very true. Yeah, I would agree with that.
But I'm also a former high school math teacher, so.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that because I was always one of the first on the team to be like, oh, hey, Bob over on line A is having issues with his email. Okay, I'll go over and fix the issue for Bob and show him how to fix the issue the next time he has it, the goal there obviously was to eliminate repeat calls into the help desk, but also I kind of liked teaching folks like Bob how to fix issues. So it's always kind of been a passion of mine.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing to see, like, early on in our careers, like what piques our interest, the kind of formative things. Like I certainly wouldn't be, it's kind of a blunt thing to say, oh, you had this, like, backup and recovery issue earlier on, and then you also like to teach people, so now you're teaching people about backup and recovery. Like, that's too blunt, right? But I think over time it seems like we do learn what it is that we like, the things that we're good at, and then we tend to, like, drift in those directions.
Right.
Not a question, just an observation. It's the John White special.
That's right. Welcome to the Nerd Journey, where I just comment and don't ask a question. I suppose at the end I could say, well, what do you think about that? But I feel like that's rude.
Yeah.
So how long did that gig last?
I think I was there. Yeah, I think that was about 2 years as well. Yep. Because this would have been 2005 going into 2007-ish time frame. I don't know for people. So this manufacturer I was working with was in the automotive supply chain, right? So they were building parts for shipping trucks, basically, right? So automotive supplier. And I don't know if people remember 2007. Maybe not everyone's old enough to remember what happened in 2007. But the auto industry really started struggling in 2007, right? You guys remember that?
Oh, I feel like everybody started struggling right around 2007, 2008.
Yep, that sounds about right.
That was a peak, the housing bubble bursting, basically.
Yep.
So there was like a lot of expansion of a lot of industries based on, exuberance, thinking that, there's all this money sloshing around because people thought they had all this value locked up in their homes and they were spending it. And then all of a sudden, people, like, collectively realized and were faced with the idea that they didn't have as much money as they thought, and spending just kind of cratered, which means that, everybody supporting spending, like supply chains, kind of took a bath.
Yeah, definitely. They so the company I was working for started to struggle, and even though kind of, again, like my first job, I was 40 hours a week, I was contracted 40 hours a week. And so I was just a line item at the bottom of somebody's Excel sheet, right? And, oh, hey.
With little to no benefits, right?
Right, exactly. And so, hey, we need to tighten down tighten the belts and get the bootstraps ready, right? And so, hey, Andy, next Friday is going to be your last day with us. So, yeah, have fun with that. So that happened in 2007.
Ouch.
It is what it is, right? And yeah, obviously there is I remember reading that email, and anybody who's gone through this, I'm sure has had a similar experience, right? And your stomach it feels like the earth just falls out from underneath you, right? And thankfully at the time I had, I just had a wife, right? I didn't have a kid or anybody else to worry about, right? It just was me and the wife at the time. So, but still, there's a very real fear of, like, holy crap, like, okay, what am I going to do now? So I just started applying for whatever looked like I'd be a fit for in the IT space. Obviously, we're staying in the IT space, and I ended up at a managed service provider is where I ultimately ended up, and that was the first job where I was, getting paid under W-2. I wasn't a contractor anymore, so I was actually part of the organization.
Nice.
But I was there for darn near 10 years in various roles. I started as a systems engineer level 1. So that manufacturing job was kind of the job I had where I really transitioned from desktop support into kind of starting to dabble in more server related stuff like Active Directory. I did some stuff with SharePoint. Portal Server 2007 back then. I mentioned Exchange earlier, so I got my hands dirty with Exchange for the first time at that job. But this managed service provider where I went to work for is really kind of where I guess I would say my skill set kind of really broadened at that point in time. If you've ever worked for a service provider, you touch a lot of different stuff with a lot of different size organizations, and I learned a lot at that job, which I'm sure we'll probably get into here. So I don't want to drive away too fast here on the questions.
No, that's an interesting observation. I'm kind of wondering, though, one of the things you said earlier on in that comment was it was the first W-2 job you had. Did you have a preference at that point? Were you like strongly looking for more of a direct employment type of position as opposed to another contract position because of the way the one ended, or not?
At that stage in my life, W-2 was definitely preferable, so my wife and I were recently married, we were at a stage where it's like, okay, we could really use health insurance of some sort, right? So here was this job offer with health insurance benefits, and that definitely was a preferable offer. I think early in my career, the flexibility of having those more contracted type engagements were really helpful, and it allowed me to do a couple of odd jobs here and there for different organizations. But yeah, at that stage in my career, definitely the W-2 route was the preferred route. Here's
a question, Andy. I want to turn it back just a tad to the getting made redundant part.
Yep.
How long was the period between when you were told that news and you got the new position? Was it a short time, or?
It was not as long as I was expecting.
Okay.
I don't remember exactly, but it was not as long as I was expecting. I want to say it couldn't have been more than 6 weeks. So I was, my direct report graciously gave me a 2-week heads up, right? Which I'm not sure many direct reports would do that,
Sure.
Given somebody who has domain admin access to your section of the corporate IT infrastructure. But he trusted me, and we had a good rapport, so I was very thankful for that 2-week heads up. So, I mean, I had a 2-week period where I was still getting paid, where I was really hitting the concrete hard, trying to find, figure out what's next, right? But I don't think it was any more than 6 weeks. It was actually pretty quick.
Sometimes when stuff like that happens, I've heard it really shakes the confidence, because it makes people think that they're not good enough because they were let go. You had a good perspective on it. I'm just a line item on a balance sheet. Did any of that baggage end up affecting your performance in the next job, even though you moved quickly? Just curious.
No, I don't think I ran into that issue at that point in time. I think I was more concerned with hey, how am I going to pay rent? How am I going to, how am I going to live, right? And I wasn't so, I said to myself, hey, these are the skills I have. This is what I'm good at. I was very confident at the stuff I could do. I just needed to find somebody who wanted to pay me to do it, right? And that was my big focus at the time. I don't recall there being a time where I was really worried or anxious about what was, I mean, obviously there is some fear there, right? But I don't remember it being the focal point, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Okay.
How quickly did you get that perspective about you just being a line item on somebody's Excel spreadsheet, as opposed to, this is like a personal thing?
Oh, I think it was almost instant, and I think it's because of the way my direct report kind of. So I heard about it via email first. So I'm sitting there in my cube reading the email, right? And instantly I'm like, after the proverbial nuclear bomb had gone off in my brain, walked into the boss's office and I said, okay, is there anything we can do about this? And he was very open about the fact that, hey, our budgets are getting slashed left and right. I was the low man on the totem pole as far as that local IT organization went at that facility. Every department was being asked to tighten. I don't remember what it was. I think it was something to the tune of 20-30%. I mean, it was pretty extreme.
Wow.
It was pretty extreme.
Wow.
So, hearing that, there was not a lot of, I didn't have the sense that, hey, it was me. It was very hey, there was some external thing that happened beyond my control. It sucks, but it is what it is, right?
Did you get a good reference out of it?
I did, thankfully, and apparently it worked for me because, yeah, like I said, it was only like a couple, 6 weeks or so between jobs. So I lucked out there.
Well, that helps too.
Right.
Both those things.
Yep.
Getting the reference and then seeing your worth in the marketplace almost immediately can really bolster that confidence, as opposed to, I know it's like, depending on the market, people just don't get, answers back for, hundreds of jobs that they applied for,
right.
For months and months and months. And neither of those is necessarily reflective on, the individual. Like, I've known people who said, hey, I haven't been able to find anything for 6 months. And then I took a look at their resume that they send out, and I'm like, oh, you just have this formatted incorrectly. It's like,
right.
So, just the simple things, like, oh, you need to put your best skills, on, the top half of page 1, not on page 3.
Right. Exactly.
Silly things like that, and, but honestly, none of us tends to be an expert at finding another job, right? It's, we
right.
hope to not be experts at that.
Exactly. And it's definitely not easy, but somehow made it work at that point in time. That's for sure.
Nice. I mean, unless you become like a serial contractor, right? Where you are literally working on like,
right.
Okay, I have like a 180-day contract, and in the middle, I need to line up the next contract. Those are the people that become like true experts at job hunting. But,
right.
That takes a special mindset, I think.
It does. And that's almost a special skill too, right? Because, I mean, you're almost in the business of sales in that situation, as well as whatever your trade is, because, hey, I need to go convince somebody else that my skills are worth buying, so I have something to walk into. But yeah, definitely, this takes a unique skill set and mindset for that.
I feel like David Klee would have some thoughts on that.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, remember we had David Klee on, and he talked about starting his own business, and he goes and works for different companies for different stints of time, working on full stack problems, but mainly around database performance issues for different applications. So, he's got to convince people that it's worth spending money on him to do something, or his company, right? And then he's in there for a specific amount of time, but there may be an interested party somewhere else that has to be spoken to. It's at a different point in the pipeline, right? Each conversation,
right?
The pre-sales, post-sales dance. That's what it made me think of.
I think the thing that it triggered in my mind was that once, I was in technical sales, that I looked at my resume and job hunting in a much, much different way,
right?
Because I had been involved in selling technical products, including, professional services to complete something. Then, it was almost like this change of mindset where I was saying, oh, I need to sell this resume to somebody, to the recruiter to get, to the next interview, and to, sell myself to the interviewer to get to the, hiring manager, or, whatever the process is. But not everybody has that experience, and not everybody's in, that kind of role. So it's just, we don't get that experience, And
it's definitely quite a shift. I mean, even if you've done technical pre-sales, right? I mean, it's one thing to sell a technical solution that solves some problem, right? But, and I've got to quote Don Jones here. I listened to your guys' Don Jones episode a couple of weeks back, and I mean, he says it perfectly in that, you have to know what problem you solve, right? I totally agree with Don when he says stuff like that. You have to know what problem you solve and get good at, convincing people about that, right?
And for those playing along at home, that's episodes 137 and 138 for reference.
Good episodes, by the way.
Nice. So I do want to get back to this idea of, being in an MSP and having multiple at-bats, right? Lots of different types of experiences, lots of different sizes of companies, lots of different types of problems. Can you expand on that a little bit and how it kind of changed your career?
working for an MSP is kind of a mixed bag, right? I mean, MSPs have a reputation of, let's get as much done as we can with as few engineers as we possibly can, right? There's kind of that reputation that industry has. But the flip side is you're going to learn more about general IT than you may have ever wanted to know. So, I think back to when I stepped into that MSP role, started at the particular branch that I was at. We were supporting a lot of nonprofits at the time. So, we're talking about organizations of varying size. I think we had one that was 200-300 heads. Another one that was, like 80-90 heads. So different size nonprofits, shoestring budgets. But it was rewarding in that, hey, let's get them as, I'm going to use a modern term here, let's get them as digitally transformed as we can with the budget that they have. But it was also, I think, the first time in my career where I really had the sense of the work that I was doing on their systems, keeping them running, was allowing them to go on and do the good work that they do, serve the communities that they serve, right? So that was one of the first times in my career where I really saw that, hey, while my impacts, while my I don't want to say chores, but the tasks that I'm doing to keep, I don't know, I'm going to pick on Bob in accounting, the jobs I'm doing to keep Bob in the accounting up and running is having a direct impact on people's lives in the community, right? So that was kind of a unique experience when I first started for that MSP. As I go on down the line throughout the years, my time with that MSP, started getting involved in different sectors of that business. So I moved on from a systems engineer to, at the time, what was called virtual systems administrator, so VSA. So basically what that position was, the second role I was at there, basically what that position was I would get assigned organizations that were large enough to where they could see benefit from having their own system admin, but were not so large that they should hire their own, right? So I was the kind of the stand-in virtual systems administrator for 15, 20 different customers. And these were, so after I made this move, I moved to a different geography. So from kind of central Michigan down to the Grand Rapids area where I'm at now. So I moved down here to the corporate office of the MSP at the time and really started serving kind of a broader customer base at that point. So it included local government, some more K through 12 education, manufacturing, a couple of service organizations, a lot of lawyers for some reason, a lot of law offices, now that I think about that. But yeah, kind of a very broad array of different customers where I would actually help advise and help make those system admin type decisions for those customers, right?
And was this a lot of primarily remote work, or were you actually making site visits to the different customers?
If I had to put a ratio to it, I guess I would say it's about 50-50. It was a pretty even split. Thankfully, all these customers were local to the area I was in. So I think the longest I would ever drive would be an hour, maybe two on a given day. So yeah, it was really a combination. But at the end of the day, the goal was to be able to support all of these customers remotely, because from an MSP perspective, that was the most cost-effective way of doing it, right?
Of course. You didn't really have to do much travel in your work before that with the automotive manufacturer and the high school that you worked for, right?
Not at all. Not at all. The only time I would have to do any travel would be like if it was after hours and I was on call and, hey, there's a fire, come fix it, right? I'm not sure I would count that as travel, right? But
right, but it's something new to get used to. If you're not used to that, I need to spend 4 hours on the road this week. It's something that takes a little bit of an adjustment.
It does, definitely.
Can you tell me a little bit about the progression, like at that MSP? Did they actively promote like learning and development in the career, or did it take something special for you to kind of extracurricularly have to go and ask about, how to expand your skills and do like the next job?
Yeah, this was the phase in my career where I guess I would say I was really hungry, right? Like I wanted to go, learn about this and learn about that and work on this for that customer. This is the phase in my career where I learned, about virtualization, SANs, fiber channel networks, iSCSI networks, all that larger infrastructure stuff. And, I'd see an EMC SAN, a rack large EMC SAN sitting over there. Hey, I want to learn about that thing, right? How does that work? How do I carve off storage from it? That was the phase of my career where I was hungry. I wanted to learn stuff. And, I would shadow other engineers quite frequently, whether they wanted me to or not. And just kind of look over their shoulder like, hey, Tim, what you working on there? That looks cool. Hey, what's that dial? What's that button do? And just kind of drive people crazy. But in the end, I think people liked it. And the powers that be, they saw that I was hungry and gave me opportunities to advance. And I think the one thing looking back at my time at MSP, anytime I was promoted or moved up into a higher position, it was always a direct result of me kind of pushing either to learn more or actively pushing and trying to advocate for myself a little bit within the management structure of the business.
And it made your blast radius even larger.
Working
with all those customers.
It did, because by the end of my time with the MSP, I was the senior cloud systems administrator. So this MSP had their own data centers, multiple, and really what it was a really large vSphere deployment that they marketed as their private cloud. Yep. And basically they would host RDS farms for customers on there if people needed, remote file servers. I mean, basically whatever businesses needed and didn't want to host themselves, we were hosting inside of this highly redundant, large vSphere environment. And that was my baby during the last 2 years of my time there. So again, going back to the term blast radius, very large blast radius there, because I think when I left, there were 40, 50 different customers running on this cluster. So, and it wasn't just the nodes themselves, right? It was the fiber channel network that sat behind it. It was the associated SANs that were on that network. It was all of the network interconnectivity, the VLANing, everything in between, right? To keep those customers all separated from each other, but also able to access their data in the way that they needed to access their data, right?
Am I accurate in saying that you were kind of pushing to expand your knowledge base as opposed to expand like the title or position that you had, or was it a little bit of both?
It's a good question. I think if I'm really honest with myself, I would say it was just more about learning stuff at the time. I mean, obviously the titles and the associated pay raise that would come along with that was always nice. I was kind of always pushing from a husband and a father perspective too. Like, hey, I got this family I got to take care of. What can I do to do better for them, right? So that was kind of a big driving factor as well, which obviously is the money side of the equation, right? The provider side of that equation. That was a driving factor as well.
Now, at one point, isn't this the place where you ended up having a small stint as a manager?
So I did. So this was, I'm trying to think of how long this was. It was about a year.
I remember that from the talk you gave at AMP Navigator this year. So I want to hear about that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, this was, I'm trying to think of what year this was. I guess it doesn't matter. But yeah, I was finally at a stage of my career after all this time where I had decided that, you know what, the 2 a.m. phone call that everything's broken, come fix it now. I'm getting real sick of that. I was getting sick of being the guy in the trench, turning the knobs, pressing the buttons, running the scripts. I already made the decision that I'm done with what I'm doing now. I was looking for what the next thing was. And I had, at that time, I'd already become aware of Microsoft's, what used to be called their tech evangelism team. And I remember seeing a webinar of some sort with Simon Perriman, which I'm sure I'll mention Simon again at some point. He was a technical evangelist for Microsoft at the time. And sitting there watching, I'm like, I do this with our engineering team on almost a weekly basis. I would usually come up with some topic and teach our engineering team something at that MSP, teach them, some new technology, or, hey, we should be doing things this way because of A, B, and C. I'm like, it'd be really cool to do that as a job, or something where I'm evangelizing solutions that solve problems for people, right? So I actually pitched that idea to the MSP, and, they didn't see a lot of value in that from at least a marketing perspective, or I think their larger concern was, hey, we're taking this billable employee who can bill his time to customers, and then you're saying we're going to pull him out of billable and he's not generating billable labor anymore. I think that's really what the problem was. Again, this is me older and wiser and more MSP experience all these years later. I can kind of look back and be like, oh yeah, that makes all kinds of sense, right?
It's all about direct labor, just like in manufacturing.
Right. So I think that's why that decision was made, and I think they didn't want to lose me at the time, so they said, hey, you'd be a really good team lead, right? And so they said, hey, here's our NetOps team. You're the team lead now. I'm like, okay, yeah, let's do that. So that's kind of how I ended up in that position. And I did that for, probably had to be almost a year before I moved on to the next job after that.
How is that team lead role different from what you thought it was going to be?
I think the hardest thing for me, and people talk about this all the time, is you're not the buddy coworker anymore, right? You're not the coworker that, your friend gripes or complains to, says, oh, hey, I have to go out here and fix this thing. Now you're the person that's asking them to, hey, I know it's 5:00, but yeah, this one place, their switch blew up and they, are still working second and third shift, and I need you to go out and take care of that. So it changes things, right? So I think that was an adjustment for me, was having to be the guy that was asking people to stay after and do extra. I always made sure to make it up for them on the back end, like, hey, just come in 3 hours late tomorrow or whatever, right? To make it fair, because I had been in their shoes many, many times before. But I think that was the hardest thing for me was, now I have to take these people who were coworkers, good coworkers, and now I'm the man, right?
And were you a technical backstop, or was it more like, I am quarterbacking to make sure we have resources to put all the fires out?
That was both, really. It was both. Yep. Thankfully, this team was 5-6 people. So, it wasn't a huge team. So, just making sure resources were available was fairly easy under most situations. But yeah.
It's just another pattern. And, hopefully it's not awkward for me to just make this observation again instead of asking a question. But career progression, even as an individual contributor or, moving into a management role, typically involves increasing your blast radius, right?
Yep.
It means, you went from, oh, hey, your virtual system administrator job was 15 companies, and that was progress, right? That wasn't where you started. But then at the end, you were covering 50, right? Yep. So in your individual contributor role, that path, it was your expertise went from, hey, I'm answering your questions, to being totally responsible top to bottom of the entire infrastructure stack for even more customers. Right. It's just an interesting pattern that we've come across. And, if people are out there, trying to make, career progress, that's an observation that you should pay attention to. It's, if you want to increase your pay and better your title, the question is, like, what more responsibility are you taking on? Like, what bigger stage can you step into? And sometimes that means managing a team of people, but sometimes it just means like taking on more responsibility and, bigger top to bottom stack, wherever it is that you are.
That's a really interesting observation, and I totally agree with everything you said. And it makes me think of something, just kind of, again, looking at my own career progression. Every time where I knew and understood I was taking on more responsibility, like, hey, I'm in charge and responsible for this larger thing now, right? I always was aware of that And in my opinion, I always kind of made a healthy decision in being like, yeah, okay, I'm good with that. I understand what I'm taking on and I'm okay with it. And I think that goes back again to my, application share explosion back at my first IT job. Again, having something like that happen kind of teaches you that, in IT, there are consequences to certain things and stuff does break in the real world, right? So again, you mentioning that just kind of makes me think of the two kind of interrelated, right?
That's really insightful. So again, maybe you can correct me if I'm hearing this incorrectly, but it sounds like what you're saying is as you took on additional responsibility, you had to make that a conscious decision, recognizing that if you were taking on additional responsibility and you didn't have the systems in place to handle the larger stage and the larger blast radius, the chances that you made a mistake that had like significant consequences were going to be increasing. I'm not
Yep.
So you really kind of need to put those systems in place, like to manage your time and attention and make sure you're not making mistakes.
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, again, coming back to that, that large vSphere infrastructure I was talking about. I mean, everybody talks about N+1. For me, it was N+2. Like, if I didn't have N+2, like, I was sweating, like N+1 is not enough for me anyway.
That goes back to blast radius.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Ooh, tough to cut it off right there, but really great stuff. I'm looking forward to next week when we hear a little bit more about that MSP move and maybe away from the MSP move. Although, I have to say, listening back, I'm going to say it again. It's that fearlessness. And if people remember me talking about that at the top in the intro, for me, it was hearing Andy talking about that fearless, breaking apart computers, tearing them apart or taking them apart and putting them back together. And, I'm just wondering if other people out there have felt that pattern that I perceived in that, hearing about that story. And that's that idea that one of the reasons why you personally might have advanced is that you didn't have the fear of breaking things irreparably, while you were poking around trying to learn about it. And, I've definitely seen people have that fear, right? Just with something as simple as the user interface for a new phone, I don't want to mess it up, don't want to break it, and so I'm afraid to press a button or, touch the screen and swipe and pinch and zoom and, just because things might break. I don't know if you've experienced this or you felt like you've experienced this. Would definitely like to hear back from you. So, tweet at us at Nerd Journey or at me, at VJourneyman. Would love to hear from you about that.
I think it's the difference between a crippling fear and a healthy, respectful fear.
Yes.
If I have a healthy, respectful fear for what I'm doing, making a big change in a data center, okay, there's a possibility of something going wrong, but I feel okay with being able to figure that out if something does, and I have a plan for when it does.
Right. And that's the knowledge of the potential impacts of the thing that you're playing around with,
Mm-hmm.
right? And making big changes on massive production systems, there's a healthy amount of fear that you should have because of the potential, impact and blast radius of a mistake there, right? And, as opposed to, hey, there's some old junker computers, do you want to, poke around inside and see what makes them tick and take them apart and move one hard drive to the other computer and turn it back on and see what happens. Those are the kinds of things that are low blast radius, small blast radius, the impact is really small, but you get practice trying to like see like what happens when something happens. So playing around on non-production systems, when you lose the fear of that, and if you're in a DevOps environment, the ability to like kind of just boom, reset the whole thing, redeploy your entire test environment from code, through a CLI or a user interface, like doesn't matter which. The fact that I can break this thing in the lab, see exactly what happens when I break it this way, try to fix it. If I can't, reset it and start over again. Anyway, like that, and I would say the thing at the very end, or towards the end, where Andy was talking about how advancement implies that like increase in responsibility, like increase in the area of effectiveness you are, or again, just the increase in blast radius, right? Like those are the things that I kind of took away from the episode, and the hunger for advancement. You lose that hunger, you stop moving forward.
When I think about blast radius, John, I think back to episode 76 where Josh Fidel called it your sphere of responsibility. Very similar there. That's a good way he described it. And that move to management, I thought it was interesting that he became the team lead, went into management. Didn't really seem like that was super interesting to him at the time. It reminded me of Ethan Banks in episode 42 where he thought he wanted to be a manager but hated it.
Yeah, every time we hear that type of story, I always think of Ethan Banks. Always.
For sure.
And that story, him telling that exact experience.
And I always like the stories of people gracefully exiting an organization. Imagine being told this is it. You have 2 weeks left. That's exactly what happened to Andy. He had the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, from a credential standpoint. In the technology environment, they didn't cut him off early. They gave him the full 2 weeks. He got a recommendation. And I like the fact that he wasn't crippled by fear. He was able to put a little bit of fear toward motivating himself to go and find the next thing because he knew that people were depending on him to do that.
But again, not that crippling fear. It's that healthy balance. Yeah, great episode. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode where we hear the next chapter in that story and what happened next to Andy. But anything else before we get out of here?
No, sir. Just listen for next week, ladies and gentlemen. I'm excited. It's going to be good. Part 2. Just a reminder again, we want people to subscribe and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. We want to know if we're being helpful and are always looking for interesting questions to ponder. We're collectively on Twitter @NerdJourney.
All right. Farewell, listeners, and tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White @VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy @NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.